Welcome everyone to the Academy of the Impossible and our weekly campaign school, which is a program we run to encourage participation in the political process, which includes both electoral campaigns, but really all the dynamics of behind the scenes, punditry, even comedy. And that really the purpose of this series is to try to really demystify and empower participants, both physically present, but also via YouTube, as we do record these sessions for posterity. And we're really honored today to have Peggy Nash, the Member of Parliament for Parkdale-High Park, partly because she has extensive experience in all sorts of different campaigns, but also because I think you've done a lot of work, both I think making the entire process more accessible, but I think also making it interesting, that the way in which you campaign, the way in which you hold yourself, I think reflects the authenticity that a lot of people, especially young people, really desire in politics. And of course, have been renamed finance critic for the NDP, which is an incredibly important position, especially given the government of today and often the credibility they try to wrap themselves around vis-a-vis their fiscal record and perhaps the vulnerability, and perhaps we'll get into that today. The format for these campaign schools are generally a very brief conversation between myself and the guests before we open it up really to participants, which is the real motivation and desire, so that we can all generally discuss politics and how we can make it more accessible, more democratic, and more interesting for all of us and for everybody. And I usually like to start these conversations and interviews really around the issue of politicization, because what's curious to me is what triggers someone deciding that they want to become political, that they want to become aware of that political reality, whether it happens early in their childhood or whether it happens later in their life. So I'm curious if you could start us off by describing when it was that you really got interested in politics and really felt that it was something that you had to be involved in, even just at a personal level, let alone institutionally in terms of when you got involved both in the labor movement and in the NDP.
Well, I don't come from a particularly political family in the sense no one in my family had ever run for office. No one would have ever seen themselves as running for elected office. But always it was, our family was always very engaged in the issues of the day. We always read the papers, heard the news, and we have a real diversity of political opinion in my family. So it's the proverbial kitchen table or dining room table where we would have huge debates, and I always felt quite comfortable. I could just hold forth on anything and I would get severely reduced if my arguments were weak or I hadn't done my homework. And so we used to have real rip-roaring debates, and I always enjoyed that. And I think my family always felt a sense of community responsibility. Our house was always a place a lot of people came over to, so there was always a lot of people around, but always a sense of being involved in the community. So it was that sense of, I just have this vivid recollection of all the neighbors getting together to build fences when they wanted, one person needed a fence, and they decided all to work together to build fences. So it was just, that was the kind of neighborhood it was. I grew up in Rexdale, and I guess when I was at university, I began to get a little more politicized, but I didn't have a lot of time because I was working to put myself through university, which was possible then, big change from today. And so I became a little more engaged, and then I worked in France for a number of months for a couple of journalists. I was looking after their kids. I was a nanny, but they had been in Latin America and had been covering a lot of events there, especially in Chile, and so that got me involved in kind of international politics, and then I got active in my union. And once you become engaged in issues around collective bargaining, any kind of power imbalance, you begin to question a lot of other power relationships, and that got me involved as well.
And I'm curious too, in the context of getting involved in the union, I mean, you almost answered it in terms of the community engagement that was a central ethic growing up. I'm also curious in terms of the psychology of what does it take to get someone in their workplace to take that next step up in terms of politicization, in terms of organization. Was it something that was part of that larger process you were going through, or was it also something that you just saw in it, your relationship with your fellow staff, with your colleagues, that you felt that motivation to try to help them by getting more involved with the union?
Well, people always have a lot of concerns or sometimes just complaints about things. But I've always been the kind of person where I don't just think about what's the problem. I'm thinking, okay, how do you fix it? What's the solution? And so I had become somewhat involved in the union because of that mentality. And then some people reached out to me and said, we want you to run for office. And as usual, I had no idea what it would involve. People say, oh, it's nothing, don't worry, you won't have to do anything. They make it sound easy, and it got me started on a long career in the union. I actually had to run a couple of times before I got elected.
And what were those campaigns like? I mean, were they, I assume, intimate in the sense that it's a relatively small constituency, but on a competitive level? I mean, what was the key dynamic in terms of winning those types of union local elections?
Well, one of the big complaints at the time was the union. I mean, I was fortunate to be in a workplace that had a union. I didn't organize it, but it was kind of a sleepy association, and it was at Air Canada, and Air Canada had been a Crown corporation. The working conditions weren't, were pretty good. We had a good, a decent salary compared to today. And but it was a very sleepy association, and so it was really about, no, let's get active. There are some issues. Let's build this organization. And it was just at the time when airline deregulation was coming in the U.S., and it was really easy to see that deregulation was, yes, it was inviting to people because it was saying, oh, your airfares can be cheaper. You can travel for a lot lower price, which is extremely appealing. But what that meant was a lot of people were going to get paid a lot less. And a lot of people were going to lose their jobs, which is what happened in the U.S. and has happened here. There's been about 25 airlines that have gone bankrupt since that. So it was really about getting involved. How do we not only defend what we have, but how do we make progress in an environment that is changing very rapidly? And it turned out, we didn't know at the time, but it turned out that airline deregulation was kind of the precursor to a whole wave of deregulation in so many areas, and privatization and free trade. In other words, the consensus that had existed, whereby if your employer does well, the people who work for the employer should do well, that consensus was about to break down. And we didn't realize we were kind of on the cutting edge of that.
Well, and did that knowledge, I mean, I almost want to ask a two-pronged question. Did that knowledge allow you to advance through the labor movement? Because you were able to literally see a trend that was going to move through industry, that allowed you certainly to help labor, which does, like any large organization, often take time to adapt, take time to respond. I'm curious if you could contrast that with the gender dynamics of organized labor traditionally being very male-dominated, and you being really a trailblazer in terms of showing the type of leadership and showing other women that they can play a role, a leadership role in a major union. I'm curious whether that was difficult or whether that was something in which that fire, that drive, certainly that threat in terms of perceived deregulation allowed you to really go and go places where perhaps others had not previously.
It's funny because our union at the time was mostly women. We were about 80% women, and yet at that time, almost all of the leadership and the staff who worked for the union were men. It was really quite striking. And yet it was almost impossible initially to interest anyone in, organizing a women's committee or a women's conference. I mean, you talk about was that vision of what was happening able to propel me? I think we were just so much in the middle of it and responding. I mean, I remember getting sent by my union to speak at a Canadian Labour Congress convention, and I was supposed to go and talk about what was happening at Air Canada, which people, I'm sure most people didn't really care about. But I got sent there, and I remember being absolutely terrified. There must have been 1,000 people in the room, and I think my knees were knocking so hard that, and I'm sure my hands were going, and it was very frightening. But I know from my experience and from other people who've been through similar experiences that if you feel passionately about something, and I did, like we were all very, very concerned, if you feel passionately about something, you go through that fear and nervousness and just do it. And I think, you know, at the time we did get a sense, those of us that were working on this, that we were trying to transform our organization because the world was changing and the people who were there didn't see it. And so, I mean, I didn't have a plan, well, I want to go from here to here. We just wanted to struggle against this change or protect ourselves from this change. And but we actually did some interesting things. We, I mean, organized the first women's conference with this group years and years ago. I don't want to tell you how many years ago. But it kind of transformed the organization because we ended up going on strike afterwards, and the women who'd been at this women's conference, who'd never been very involved in any feminist issues, began to play leadership roles on the picket line, and many of them subsequently ran for positions of leadership, and subsequently we had an unbroken series of women presidents in that group that's actually remained unbroken to this day. So it really built an involvement and a capacity that we hadn't had before. And it wasn't to say men shouldn't play a role. There were obviously lots of men still involved, but it seemed to open the doors for women to get more involved. And it
tapped into the interest. It showed that there was an actual desire to participate. It was just perhaps an issue of knowing how and where to get involved. I mean, is that something that you saw reflected in general in terms of, I mean, the other dynamic, not just in terms of gender, but is also sort of small d democracy, of getting more members involved, getting more rank and file involved. I mean, was that also something that you saw as being necessary for effective campaigns and for achieving some of the goals that, at least in the labor movement, let alone in the political level, are desirable?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what that taught me was, because the way things had been run up until then, and it's not just because of me, there were a number of us, but it had been very bureaucratic and dry and boring and uninteresting, and nobody wanted to be part of that. And I think of riding associations where it's like just dry business as usual. There's no passion to it. And once people felt they were part of something, they could build something, and that by being involved they could make a difference, people wanted to be involved. And ultimately it was a struggle for survival, so people really wanted to be involved. But I've seen that in political organizing is, if, you know, I don't agree that people are apolitical. I think people feel passionately about a whole range of issues, especially young people. I know I knock on doors, I go to events, I see people, and people feel passionate about various issues, the environment or housing, reducing inequality, whatever the issue is, but it's finding a way to connect that passion with real meaningful action. And I think that's the key to political organizing, whatever it is, whatever the organization, whether it's big P politics or community building, is for people to find a way to act on the passion they feel for change.
And was it that success that, I mean, I guess I'm curious to know whether there was a tipping point where you felt that the battles you were waging within the context of the labor movement against deregulation, against, say, neoconservatism, neoliberalism, was there a point where you decided that you had to to run for public office, where it wasn't enough to just be organizing within the context of labor, but rather within the context of society as a whole? Or was it just a natural evolution, that you were involved in these different campaigns, in different mobilizations around different issues, and it developed the skills and the confidence to take it to the next level in terms of where that struggle, where that battle was going?
I think both are true. I think by being involved in not just my union, but in a lot of community organizations, you develop the confidence and the skill and the bigger vision about what's possible. And I think that's true for anyone who gets involved in any kind of organization. You develop skills you're not even aware you're developing, whether it's interviewing or chairing meetings or public speaking, negotiating. But I might have just stayed active in the union and in community organizations, but I began to feel this just tremendous frustration that no matter how much we mobilized and how hard we worked on childcare, for example, and promises about, yes, we're going to bring in childcare, yes, we're going to do this, and then never acting, even when there was an opportunity to do it. Investing in the city, how many announcements were there about the waterfront, we're going to do all of this in the waterfront, and then a lack of action. Transit is another one. And so I just began to feel so frustrated that you can mobilize and campaign for change, but it matters who actually gets to vote in Parliament or at the city, and who gets to decide how money gets spent. How money gets raised and how money gets spent. And it's, I thought, you're there, you're occupying a position, but you're not acting even when you have the resources and the opportunity to act. And I thought, you know what? Political power is about making change, but it's also about preventing change. And I felt that there were too many people preventing change.
Well, and it's interesting as I'm listening to you, there's certainly, I think, an intellectual prerequisite that you had from your previous professional experience. So I'm curious, just on a skill level, was there anything when you went from labor into politics, traditional sort of elected politics, was there anything that made you sort of go shock and go, oh my God, I need to learn this really quickly? Because it almost sounds as if you had developed all the different elements that you require to run successful campaigns, to be in the public eye, to engage in the marathon of community events and canvassing that a lot of the politicians who have visited us have described. So I'm curious if there was a blind spot that you discovered early on that really shocked you, that made you think, if only I could have told the Peggy of a few years ago, hey, this is what you really need to know. Was there something like that that was a real shock from that transition from traditional labor organizing to public life and public office?
Well, so many skills are transferable from community organizing to public life. And I have to say, the first time I stood up and gave a speech in the House of Commons, I felt, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a university professor, but I have as much right to be here as anyone else. It is the House of Commons. And I just felt so confident that I could stand in my place and fulfill this role. But I have to say, I was really not prepared to make the transition from private life to public life, even though I had done a lot of, I did a lot of television interviews and I don't know, I'd appeared before parliamentary committees. I wasn't prepared for the shock of seeing my picture on campaign signs, and just wherever you are, you're always a public person and you're always on the record. We were just joking ahead of time, you're always on the record. And I did a CBC interview recently, and they said, well, we're going to play a tape from you from 1991. And I thought, oh my God, what did I say in 1991? And it turned out to be something, fairly innocuous, but I just said, boy. But you're always on the record. And I just have to say, the first time I ran unsuccessfully in 2004, I remember the day the writ was dropped. And we were all ready, like we had our signs. I'd been knocking on doors for a few months. And I remember I was down in the Warren Park area. It's a valley down by the Humber River. And as we were coming out of the valley. We were driving out of the valley. We'd been knocking on doors and knew, because people told us, oh, I just heard on the news that the election's called and you're out here already. We've been out there for months. So as we're coming out of the valley, I see signs with my picture on it, and I just thought, oh my God, I am out there. And that was a big adjustment. Nothing prepared me for that. You know, now I'm out there and I accept it, but it is a big transition, and once you are officially in public life, it's you're there. I remember going to a bank machine, and the person standing in front of me in line on Roncesvalles said, are you my member of parliament? And I said, yeah. And he says, well, I want to talk to you about childcare. Anyway, some other people came in, and we had kind of this mini childcare meeting in at the bank machine foyer, and that happens all the time. So, well, not the meeting, but people stop you and ask you things. So.
Well, and I asked that question because, I mean, again, you have such a diverse range of explicit campaign experience. And I think one of the campaigns that is perhaps very important but often does not get the public scrutiny or attention is the party president. Because obviously it's a behind-the-scenes role, and it's usually not meant to have the type of attention that the party leader contest would have. So I'm curious, I mean, again, you seem to have a really complementary set of professional and political experiences that have built both a confidence and a capacity that's really quite impressive. Both, A, what motivated you to run for party president, and what kind of a campaign is that like? I mean, what kind of a campaign do you run, again, from a competitive perspective, to be able to win the post of president of the party?
Well, the campaign is, what motivated me to run was I was asked to run. That's, Anne McGrath, who had been the president, said, and I had lost an election, and she said, why not put your experience to good use and play that senior role? And it's an important role because you're in a lot of the top meetings, you're making you're not making the final decision, but you've certainly got a key role to play in terms of campaign preparation and issues identification, recruiting candidates, and just connecting with the party apparatus on a day-to-day basis. Although it's a volunteer job, so I had a full-time job that I was doing, as opposed to party staff who are working there full-time. And so I had people helping me. I certainly was very different from running in a leadership campaign. I didn't travel across the country. I did some phoning, but mainly it was a convention-based campaign. And, everyone voted at the convention. So I did some preparatory work, but very low budget and very minor in terms of the campaigning. And there were just 2 candidates, so.
And do you think it gave you any insights in terms of then running for leader, that it allowed you both to understand perhaps the diversity of the party, but also maybe some of the challenges and opportunities that the party faced?
Yes, and it was at a very different time. It was when we were a 4th party, but very badly wanting to move up and become a more important party. And so it was an exciting time because we're in building mode and trying things out, and you never know what's going to work. For example, it was always Jack Layton's vision to build in the province of Quebec, that we couldn't win nationally unless we had a strong base in Quebec. And a lot of people tried to say, forget Quebec, we're never going to win in Quebec. The Bloc is a social democratic party, and we're not going to defeat the Bloc in Quebec. And Jack put a lot of resources in, he recruited good candidates, there was a lot of organizing that took place, great advertising, a lot of building, and suddenly everything changes. And so what that taught me was, if you have a vision and you work towards it, you just might win. Sometimes it goes the other way, but sometimes you win.
Well, and there's always, I think, in any organization, a small c conservative that is not open to change, not open to new things. And I think you've always sort of been, in any context, the person who is pushing for new things and who is pushing for change. I'm curious, in the context of the leadership contest, which because of the tragedy of Jack's death, was unique in that it really was opening up a new era, and everyone could acknowledge it, quite frankly, as a new era. What was that like? And I'm curious about this, not just in a campaign sense, but as a political junkie sense, that it must have allowed for fantastic conversations and fantastic connections in having that privilege to travel the country and be able to meet people. So even before we get into the campaign dynamics, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the experience and what it meant to you, both as a politician, but also as an individual, and why you'd encourage other people to do, to take the hard work, the crazy amount of hard work. I'm curious to hear that argument of why it really is, worth all that effort.
Well, it's, obviously I was campaigning to win and I didn't win, but it's an experience I wouldn't have missed for anything. Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously you always hope that you do better if you're not successful, but the people that I met, and we mobilized an amazing team of young activists, and we probably, in retrospect, might have benefited from some people who'd actually done leadership campaigns before. We were kind of creating it all as we were going. And it's a very, very, very different experience from the US, where it's infested with private wealth and corporate money. And, people really go at each other in a very vicious way. And I felt that we were actually debating ideas. We had very small campaign budgets, and I think, debated a lot of important ideas and tried to maintain that civility amongst all of us. I think that's a good way to run a campaign, where the debate was over differences in ideas. But I just had the incredible privilege of meeting mostly young people from across the country, some of whom had never been party members before, and joined the party in order to become involved in the leadership campaign. Environmentalists, anti-poverty activists, some people who've been involved in the Occupy movement, marijuana party activists, people who believed passionately that we can do a lot better, that we can make changes. And I found them so inspiring. The energy that people brought to our campaign and to the convention really kept me going.
Well, and I'm curious how you mentioned the modesty in terms of the financing of the different campaigns. And certainly one of the recurring threads that have come up here in campaign school is the need to make politics more accessible by limiting the amount of money that can be spent. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, to elaborate a bit more on the dynamics and even speculate on, excuse me, if we were to radically lower what candidates are able to spend, what kind of an impact that would have, not just on the tone of the campaign, which I think you were inferring, but also its accessibility in terms of people being able, like Nikki Ashton, being able to run a very visible, very credible campaign and bring a lot to a contest in terms of substance and in terms of I think, giving people the very legitimate belief that not only is the party in good hands in the present, but has a very bright future. Do you see a direct connection between lowering the amount that people can spend and that type of participation and accessibility and substance?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially if you want diversity of candidates, because it's difficult to raise money. It's difficult to raise money. And unless you've got big benefactors that are going to write big checks, and I don't think that's a good thing. I think that's a bad thing. I would rather, I don't want a country financed by billionaires. I think it's better to have people involved with small contributions. And, we're a country that believes in a democratic franchise, one person, one vote. And I think our politics should reflect that. I mean, there's ways of doing things much differently. For example, in our leadership campaign, the debates were televised on CPAC, and not everybody gets CPAC, and sometimes it was difficult to find, so they weren't as visible as they might have been. But rather than spending a fortune in television advertising, if TV networks were required to air a certain number of political ads, and they were unpaid, or there were more access to debates in a way that, I mean, we had a lot of debates. I don't even remember now how many debates we had across the country. Only the official national debates, I think there were 6 of them, were televised. But it was only when we got to the convention that the national media really engaged, and then they began to show the debates live. And I think in a federal election campaign, you could imagine how the media could open up the process a lot more. It would reduce the costs, especially because the Conservatives are going to get rid of the campaign financing funding. So what that's going to mean, I think it, I think it's good the way we finance campaigns now as opposed to the American system. But I can also imagine a system where, as you engage people in politics, you're asking them to not only volunteer or take an interest, but to make a contribution. And it used to be, long before the time of any of us, it used to be that if you joined a union, somebody had to go around the workplace every month and ask people to contribute. If you want to be part of this organization and you believe in it, you have to make a contribution, and that's the way it was financed. And that could be the way we finance political parties, is to have people make a contribution. The difficulty is the maximum donation is $1,200, and there's a lot of our supporters who can't afford $1,200, even on a monthly basis. That's a lot of money for people. Whereas for, say, some other parties, $1,200 might not be too much, and they'll get the maximum. So, but I think having people make that connection, that's really what we're going to have to do once the law changes.
And certainly in the interest of political fairness, I suspect that the right sort of sees, say, the Working Families Coalition and some of the sort of ad spending that they do as equally unfair, although they tend to be blind to the power that they have vis-a-vis the media and vis-a-vis the larger influence. So I'm curious to tie that in, to get your thoughts on social media and the potential of grassroots media playing a role both in informing the electorate, but also in engaging people in the political process. And I mean, it was interesting how you described that very physical process of getting people to reaffirm their commitment to the organization, to the union, to the party. Can you see that also happening in terms of social media? Were the young people that you were meeting in terms of your leadership campaign, was that something that they saw as a meaningful way to connect with you and maintain that connection that they might have made physically, but then maintain virtually after you come back to Toronto or go back to Ottawa?
Yeah, I mean, we had a very, very active social media campaign, and it was a way to connect with people in a way that I think was different from other campaigns. And I think Lead Now, for example, in BC, played a huge role in getting people to sign up. And that was an online campaign. So I think that social media can play a huge role, and excuse me, it's I think in a good way in terms of not being so dependent on the mainstream media. I think that's a positive thing, but I always have in my mind the caution that social media is no substitute for personal engagement and for actually showing up and doing things. Like, I think you need both. I think social media is an amazing tool for connecting people who want to be part of a movement. But sending a petition online or posting something on your Facebook, I think is not enough. I think it's a wonderful tool to motivate people to take another step And I think we're still exploring how those other steps will take place. But I mean, we've seen demonstrations here and around the world where social media has motivated people to take action. And I think probably the student protests in Quebec are very, very largely connected by social media.
Which are getting very poor coverage outside of Quebec in terms of people understanding what's happening. And I'm curious actually to take that metaphor. I agree in terms of that there isn't a mutual exclusivity, that you need to have the material reality and that we are still physical humans with physical bodies. But if I could take a very generous parallel that I'm curious to get your perspective as someone who's been both in organized labor and in political parties at multiple levels of both hierarchy and engagement, and whether the role of the political party in our society is being redefined. In that, I mean, certainly social media breaks the monopoly of journalism that mainstream media used to have, but it also kind of breaks the monopoly on political voice and the monopoly on political activism that parties traditionally had. To what extent is the political party now not just competing for attention with the Canadian Idols and the other sort of breads and circuses, but also with the Lead Nows? The extent to which, like, Lead Now isn't the waffle. It's not a threat to the party. They would never even articulate themselves that way. It's more that it's a dilution, that there's just other groups who are doing what the party might have done. What role does that play for the party and for members of parliament in the party to maintain that relationship with grassroots movements, to maintain that relationship with almost sibling organizations that won't run for office, that are not capital P political, but still comprise the electoral force that you would need to become the government, to succeed electorally? Do you see the role of the party changing in the context of this world in which anyone can express themselves and anyone can organize themselves, albeit virtually, but even sometimes materially in the form of how Occupy did?
It's funny, you think back centuries ago, and people would communicate often with pamphlets. There would be pamphleteering on the street, and anyone could stand up and speak, and it seemed, and then you saw much more concentration of media, so that only a few voices got heard, a fewer number of voices got heard. And it's almost as though social media gives us a return to pamphleteering, where people can anyone can express their view, and people of like mind can more easily come together. And you don't always necessarily have to come together on a street corner, but you might come together electronically and then end up on a street corner. But I think they're complementary. Community organizations, political movements, and political parties. And that was part of my leadership campaign. I come from a background of movement politics, and I think movement politics often is what engages people to take the first step to act. And, I think about this. I've used this example of this young woman who came up to me at a town hall in Vancouver and said, my issue is salmon, because I had released a salmon policy, and she said, my issue is salmon. And I learned when I was in BC that salmon is everything in BC. People really identify with sustainability of salmon, and she was so frustrated that politicians were talking about it, but things weren't changing. And she had taken her strong desire to improve public policy and make concrete changes on salmon to engaging in electoral politics. And I hope that we can foster those bridges, so that whether I'm someone who's a campaigner on tenant rights or animal cruelty or any of the massive environmental concerns that we're facing, people who that's their issue, that's what they want to see changed, is that we can connect around the values of those changes we want to see take place, so that there may be, a specific issue like salmon that someone wants to see changed, but we can join in common cause and engage politically at an electoral basis, so that we can make a number of changes. And it's only by doing that that we can address the salmon issue and the housing issue and other issues that we're facing. Unless we make those connections and work together across our different issues, we're not going to be able to succeed on I want to say any, but on many of them.
Mm-hmm. And I should logistically point out that I'm enjoying myself so thoroughly that with each answer, I'm thinking of 2 more questions. So now would be a good time if anyone would like to stand up at the mic to take their own questions. I'll certainly have one to ask if anyone wants to think before they stand up. But if you don't, I will continue going for the entire session. And explicitly, following off that answer, I'm curious as finance critic. I'm curious, within the context now in opposition, and a very young opposition in terms of both who is part of the party, but also who's interested in the party and who voted for the party. I'm curious the type of campaign that being in opposition one runs, both in preparing for the final electoral campaign, but also in a very distracted environment in which it's tough to get people to pay attention to politics. It's tough to get people to pay attention to the opposition, because it's often the government that has the tools that allow them to set the agenda, that allow them to try to, so it's a 2-pronged question. A, as finance critic, what kind of campaign do you see that you have to do now in laying the groundwork? And secondly, to what extent can young people and the young people in caucus play a role in sort of making politics interesting and accessible and appealing to Canadians as a whole?
Big questions, but we have this amazing caucus and such an incredible opportunity, because whereas some of the other parties they feel very stale and older, we have all this amazing dynamic young energy in our party, and amongst our MPs, when I was in Montreal, I met with the McGill NDP Club, and I said, you folks are very smart to join the NDP McGill Club, because half of your former colleagues are now members of Parliament. We have 5 McGill students in our caucus. So there is that connection. You send some of, but you send a Rathika Sitsabaisen from Scarborough out to speak to a young group of Scarborough activists, youth. You just have incredible opportunity. So yes, we need to get our young MPs, we need to showcase them, and I've been thinking about, in our area, in the West End of Toronto, how to showcase some of these new MPs, and not just in Toronto, or the MPs from Toronto, but MPs from rural and suburban ridings in Quebec, people who are very talented. I know we talk about students, but we also have psychologists, doctors, we have a former diplomat, we have economists, we have an amazing array of talent, a number of trade unionists. I think one of the main things I want to do in terms of the finance portfolio, and it's something I tried to do during my leadership campaign, is really make the case that the Conservatives have made the Conservatives have argued that they're good economic managers. And I don't know how you can make the case that they're good economic managers when inequality in Canada is at a level we haven't seen in decades, when people have the highest level of personal debt in the history of our country, when tuition is becoming even more unaffordable for students, especially here in Ontario, when unemployment is at double digits for young people. And if you look at the kinds of jobs that are getting created, not to say there aren't any good jobs getting created, but increasingly we're seeing a loss of jobs that offer people a decent standard of living. And if young people look to the future and they think of the incredible incredibly destructive environmental legacy that we're going to be left with. And combine that with the economic and social legacy. So I think that we need to make the case that these conservatives are not good financial managers, because you can't have a good economy based on growing inequality, social hardship, and environmental degradation. So that's the case I want to make. And I want to connect with people across the country who want to become engaged in terms of building a better world. Maybe I'm biased, having been with progressives for the last 6 months in a leadership campaign, but I think there's a real appetite in Canada for a different vision and a different reality in people's day-to-day lives.
Well, and as I mentioned, I've got tons of questions, but thankfully people have lined up, so I'll hold them until there's no light or until I abuse my power as host. King, you've got the first question.
I have a question now. What do you think about the correctional system?
Oh, I think there's, again, a complete diversion between the path the Conservatives are taking and the path that I think we need to take in Canada. For example, the Conservatives with their new crime bill focusing on mandatory minimums is going to mean a lot of young people, especially young people, but others, will get sent to prison needlessly, and it's going to destroy a lot of lives. So I think it's at a time when crime is declining, all kinds of crime is declining in Canada. We're going to end up locking a lot more people up in prison. The conditions are already overcrowded. Our justice system is already grossly overloaded and backlogged. And we're going to see, through this new crime bill, yet another example of poor economic management, because we're going to see governments spend billions of dollars on the criminal justice system that's really going to deny a lot of people justice.
All right, I'm not going to keep it up. I have two more quick questions.
Go ahead, Kate.
The next one was, if someone's being mistreated in the correctional system, what's the best way they could contact someone? Because a lot of people tried it on Ombudsman, but the Ombudsmans never work. It's just, all right, file a paper, it'll get put away or probably burnt, or no one will ever look at it. So, what's the best way of going about it? Because I know the correctional system, especially in the East Detention, they'll go on lockdown because it's a beautiful day outside, and they'll just tell you, it's a good day outside, but you guys are locked down. So, what would be...
And would writing to your MP, for example, be, one of the means that one might take?
Writing to the MP of the Scarborough, right?
Yeah, or to your MP necessarily. I mean, sorry, it's a good question. Sorry to...
You know what might be an interesting idea is to approach, if that's a provincial facility, approach the opposition and the NDP in Ontario, and ask them to put together a delegation to tour the facility and do a report on the criminal justice system and the conditions in the jails, because it's something that I think doesn't get a spotlight shone on it. And I know abstractly, as an MP, I hear conditions are terrible, that it's way overcrowded, people are mistreated, but I have no firsthand experience. And I think it would be, thank goodness, so far, but I think it would be helpful, and maybe, obviously you're going to get the nice tour, but it would be helpful to get some political representatives going through the correctional facility and actually being able to speak with some of the inmates. I don't know, it's just one idea.
All right, this is the last question. You see, when you have a correctional system, the thing I don't understand is it's based to correct you, but then once you're done doing your time and you go to apply for a job, it's like they don't want somebody with a criminal record. So my point of view is, so what's the point of doing all that time supposedly being corrected where you're really being mistreated, and then you try to go legit, and it's just like they want you to go back into the system. So
I think you raise a really good point, and if I look at the approach that the federal government is taking now, everything seems driven towards not rehabilitation and helping people get their lives back on track, but in fact to do what exactly you're saying is keep people rotating through the prison system. And when something like that is happening, I always ask myself, so who would benefit from that? Who would benefit from that? Not the people who are stuck in jail. Yes, there are some genuinely dangerous, bad people who should be separated from the community, but for the average person, does it make sense to destroy their lives like that? People make a mistake. Does it make sense to destroy their lives? No. So who benefits? Well, if you look at the U.S., it's a huge growth industry, private jail systems. Companies make a lot of money off of that. And again, I don't know enough about the current situation here, but my fear is that that's the path we're going down, that that'll be a growth industry. And how convenient. You don't provide enough jobs for people. You don't provide adequate housing for people. So what do? You warehouse them in jails where a few people make a lot of money off it. So I think that's the wrong way to go. And I think political parties need to be engaged on it. I don't think that's the case right now, but that could change.
Next question.
Peggy, you spoke about the civility of the NDP leadership contest, and it was certainly something that was to be admired, because it seems to me in this day and age, civility is something that's being lost from the political process. I mean, politics is a rough and tumble game. It always has been. You got adversaries, fighting over public opinion and whatnot. But it seems like in recent times, it's gotten worse. The adversarial, become antagonistic. It's become nasty. We see hardened positions. We see, hatred of the opposition. Is it possible to bring civility back into the political process as a whole? I mean, my belief is that it will come back when there's more women coming in, because men have a problem with fighting, Is it possible to I saw last week, I was reminded about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms when it came in, how they had, members of 3 parties working together for a common goal, and it seems like that sort of thing is not likely to happen anymore. Is it? Is it possible to bring that kind of decency and civility back?
Yeah, I'm convinced that it is. I think that it has been a very successful political tactic for some parties to find narrow issues of polarization and then absolutely demonize and relentlessly attack the opposition. And we've seen that on things like the gun registry. I don't know, what else have we, just the whole pension, youth unemployment debate right now. That politics of division. And, I always have the impression there's a gang sitting in the back room who figures, if we divide people and pit them against each other, then we've got enough votes here that we can win. And it's a simple calculation. I don't think we're well served by that as a country. One of the issues that I campaigned on for the leadership was to change our electoral system to proportional representation, which I think doesn't guarantee civility, but because it does make it harder to get an out-and-out majority government, it means you have to have more cooperation. Some people say, well, that's like having a perpetual minority government. Is that a good thing? Does that mean government can never do anything? I think it forces parties to discuss and cooperate to find common ground, and I think maybe allows for government to be a little more balanced and less polarized, which I think is a good thing.
Good.
And getting more women elected will be good too.
Yeah. Thank you. Next question.
Yeah, the question I had to do with...
And actually, do you mind speaking to the mic so we can get it for the YouTube?
sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah, so one of the strategies that the Conservatives have adopted, and they've been incredibly good at, is going after the so-called ethnic vote across the country, I guess. My question just goes to that, and as to what your sense is of how parties that are in opposition can counter that at the party level, and then at the sort of individual level, for those of us that are members of ethnic communities, what you think the best ways are of organizing our own communities kind of against the, not infiltration, but whatever strategies the Conservatives have adopted in order to organize communities to vote Conservative.
And I would break that into two, because I think one is the issue of the way they target particular ethnic and multicultural communities, but the other is the practice of targeting itself and the role that targeting has played in terms of campaigning. So if you could speak to both points, I think it would be really interesting.
It's funny, as a member of Parliament, I work with different ethnic communities in my area because I represent those communities. So, for example, we have a big Tibetan community in Parkdale. I work with them, the Filipino community, the Poles, the Ukrainians, and so I go to all their events. And what I noticed going back several years was every event I went to, Jason Kenney would be there. he was everywhere. I mean, they worked very hard. And what they did was they would go to events and they would listen and hear what the concerns were, and then they would find ways to make progress with certain communities. And you saw apologies, you saw His Holiness the Dalai Lama was given official Canadian or honorary Canadian citizenship. There were a number of things that were done, and it was done very deliberately, obviously, to move votes to the Conservatives, and it worked well in some areas, and in other areas it didn't. So, in the one hand, it's, I guess, not very flattering to some communities where they're feeling maybe that they're being used politically. On the other hand, I do encourage different ethnic communities, religious communities, to make their voices heard. So I went to last December 23rd, I was invited to represent Nicole Turmel, our interim leader, at a conference called Reviving the Islamic Spirit down at the Convention Center. I showed up and I didn't know what to expect. There were 20,000 people there. There were 20,000 people. It was massive. And mostly young people. I'd say at least half would be under the age of 30. And I encourage people to become involved politically because they need, people need to have their voices heard. And it doesn't mean communities vote en masse, in block. I think it's, communities have a diversity of opinion. But it's important for the leaders of a given community to be able to speak in political life, and for the members of that community to know that they're being heard. So, for example, in our area, it's a big Ukrainian community. And I go to all the Ukrainian events. I've been to Ukraine twice as an election observer. The former president, Yulia Tymoshenko, is locked up in jail right now, and so I've been outspoken on that because that's who I represent. And I think a good political party is making those connections, not just on a riding level, but across the country. Conservatives just did a very good job, but unfortunately, what they're then doing is using that to target certain groups and reject others, which I find not very good for nation building. So you pick sides in political disputes, and I don't think bringing those debates here is as helpful to nation building as it should be.
Sharita?
Full disclosure, I actually run a research center in terms of the social economy, and I don't know if you're aware of the social economy What the social economy basically is looking at cooperatives, social enterprises, social finance, etc. And one of the things that makes me hopeful is that usually in a time of economic upheaval, you will get alternate forms of economy raising up and, trying to work themselves out, which I think is happening now, and I think it's actually happening across Canada. However, even though that's a very positive sense, what I'm also hearing at various points in time from speeches by the Conservative Party is they're beginning to laud the social economy because it would be a way of actually cutting down on services that governments give to normal people by saying, oh no, what you have to do now in terms of services, etc., is compete within the market. And that's actually not what social economy is at all. So I'm wondering if you as the finance critic or the NDP have thought at all about the social economy and social investments.
Yeah, thanks for that. Actually, it was raised with me when I was in Halifax at a leadership event, and so I have done some thinking about that. And I agree with you. There are really positive elements of it. I think. I've lived in a housing co-op, and I'm a big believer in co-op housing. I think it makes housing affordable, and it at a time when we have such a scarcity of affordable rental accommodation would be a huge boost for the housing market for people to be able to find affordable housing. And I know in our neighborhood in the West End, we have the West End Food Co-op, which has been starting up, and it's about buying local, it's about connecting people with food, it's about community engagement, and it has a lot of really positive benefits.
We're also trying to pioneer a new form of investment called social impact bonds.
I know I'm a bond holder. I never thought I would say I'm a bond holder, but I am. So yes, there are obviously many positive things. I think I see it a little bit differently with the Conservatives. I think what they want to do is move to not a community-based model, but a charity-based model. I think they would actually like to move things back to where it's charities pick up the community responsibility, or whether it's the church, and I'm not to in any way belittle the amazing work that many religious organizations do in terms of building community. But I just see their approach is, yes, one of more self-reliance, but it's just getting government out. And so who will pick up the slack? I see community organizations that used to apply for government funding, which, as bureaucratic as some of the processes were, at least was publicly financed, now having to write to foundations and endowments. So it's up to the banks or wealthy individuals whether there is merit to a given proposal and whether or not it gets financing. To me, that's, I understand organizations want to get funding where they can, but it's to me, it's less democratic. So I'm not arguing for status quo. I think it's good when people build community and become more engaged, whether it's in buying local or reconnecting with food or building community gardens or whatever the issue is. I think community engagement is a positive thing, and I think governments should help support that, not work against it. And so I don't think the old status quo was necessarily the right model. I think definitely where the Conservatives are going is the wrong model. I think that there is a movement of community engagement that can help us build a different kind of future. And I'd like, as finance critic, to begin putting forward some ideas about how to build that engagement and also cost effectively the lack of engagement. So, for example, making people aware of the true cost if we're importing our lettuce from Chile as opposed to buying lettuce from southern Ontario, what is the true environmental cost of that? So I think providing services but also costing how we provide our economy.
Jonathan?
Hi. Am I talking into the
Yeah, you
mic
don't have to literally lean in, just in the general direction.
Okay. Hey, a subject and a skill set that like must have followed you and been developed in like a quite remarkably central way in most of your roles in public life, in the union, in the interface between your union, the CAW and the NDP, in the NDP at a local campaign level, in minority parliaments, certainly in the NDP at the level of the party presidency and making internal decisions, and for all the talk of civility in the leadership race, has been conflict and conflict resolution within organizations, even where everyone is moving in the same direction, but maybe may have different ideas about how to do so, different teams around different people and so on. You probably have quite a bit of insight or unusual insight into that. I was wondering if any takeaway lessons or examples of conflicts within groups and ways people have worked together to resolve them came to mind, maybe something that might be transferable to us as a sort of campaign school in conflicts we might get into in our activism. Also, maybe dovetailing with that, something you and some of the greatest from every party have had experience with is bouncing back after losing some sort of contest, like your first and third, I think, parliamentary races, and the leadership, and maybe there's some connection between those two subjects. I was wondering what insight you might have into those.
Great questions.
First of all, on conflict, I mean, I think conflict is really healthy, and it takes me back to my childhood sitting around the dining room table because we had lots of conflict. But it was always around ideas, and I think the key is to never lose respect for others in a debate or a conflict. Like, I'm not one of the people who demonizes conservatives. You know, they have their worldview, and I may not like it, I may not agree with it, but I'm not going to demonize them for that. I'm sure I'll have families and friends, and they justify their worldview, and so I think once you engage in kind of personalities, it's almost as though you don't have confidence in the logic of your ideas, that you have to, attack someone personally. So I think maintaining that level of civility, no matter how difficult and oppositional the debate is, I think is important. And always, I guess something I learned in negotiations is always trying to hear openings for common ground with your opponent or with those with whom you have differences, because sometimes something that could be a little detail that seems like an opening is an opportunity to find common ground and be able to do something. So we might disagree on 95%, but maybe that 5% we can actually move forward on. And my experience in trying to motivate people and build participation is that if you're always oppositional and you can never make progress, people will lose faith in you. You have to actually succeed. And it doesn't have to be big things, but you have to be able to show progress, and that will keep people motivated to want to continue to participate, because no one will sign up for futility forever. So you've got to, it's not a big selling feature. So
I know, so some of us were members of the NDP for a while through some
some really lean years.
Yeah. Yeah, and so ideas and a vision are also so critical, and that inspires you. Like I think that you have to have the big vision of how the world could be different, because it's hard to get people really passionate about those kind of nickel and dime changes, right? And yet it's the nickel and dime changes that say, I'm on that path to the bigger vision. That's kind of how I would see it.
Which sounds almost like the answer to Jonathan's other question of how do you bounce back? I mean, inevitably, anyone who desires a life in public office will face defeat, will face setback. How do you recover from that? And as you've done so resiliently and so quickly, I think is also a fair statement. There are other people who suffer electoral loss who tend to disappear from the public scene for even several years. But you've been really quite resilient in not just the leadership that you provide, but as you say, the passion and motivation. I mean, where do you get that? As I think as many of us are thinking, yeah, where can I get some of that? I mean, as a journalist, I hate pitching articles, let alone running for office. So,
I guess, for me, the goal is not about just me being elected politically. The goal is I see a better world. I believe passionately that a better world is possible. I know it's possible. I know there are other countries that have made changes that we haven't made yet, so I absolutely know it's possible. And I'm going to find a way to do that work. And whether it's in elected office or through a community organization or whatever, I'm going to find a way to play a role. And so I know I'm going to be able to satisfy my passion for social justice and my passion for changing things. And just as I don't personalize other people in politics, I don't take politics personally. Yes, there are disappointments. I mean, in the leadership campaign, there are people who I went to, colleagues, people I've worked with for years, and really like you to support me, and nope, just don't see you as leader. You're not the gal for me. And it's like, okay. So I guess you do kind of develop a bit of a rhino hide, but you can't take it personally. Like, I think I'm a good person, I work hard, and I think, working for the same things that we all share and care for, and we may have different paths for getting there. So yes, there's disappointments. Like, yes, I was disappointed in that we didn't do better in the leadership campaign because our team was so passionate and people worked so hard, as did all the teams. But I have always felt that it's not because I'm a bad person. Maybe there's things, I try to learn from it. There's things we could have done better, so I'll learn from it. But if it's not to be that I'm in electoral politics, then nobody's going to close all the doors to me. I'm going to find a way to play a role somewhere.
Right on. Next question.
Hello. So this relates to the second question a bit, and I think a little bit what you're saying about the worldviews as well, in terms of what we're seeing right now and in the South, what happened in the Toronto municipal politics, and this idea of this creation of a new reality, and that fake reality being what people are voting on, whether it was Rob Ford's platform or Stockwell Day's imaginary crimes, or unreported crimes rather, and where do you see, I guess, social media and these sort of, going beyond these four walls here? How do you break through that? Where do you see us breaking through that sort of that fiction that is being sold as fact now? And having campaigned for you, I've had those conversations with people where they're actually saying things to me, provincially, also municipally, where they're actually saying things that aren't true, but they take as fact. And sort of a little bit tangentially off of that is also this new reality that is going to be coming with the new ridings. And how do you see that affecting, because we have no idea what that's going to look like. And how do you see that affecting the distribution of resources within organizations and organizers and so on?
Well, I think one of the biggest victories of conservative politics or right-wing politics has been to diminish the belief amongst progressives that we can change things for the better, and that we can win, and that we can change things for the better. And I think that's massive. Unless we continue to feel with confidence that we can articulate a vision for a better world, that we believe strongly that yes, we can reduce inequality, that yes, we can have a sustainable environment, that yes, we can reduce unemployment and in fact have full employment, that yes, that progressive change is possible, that we can defend human rights and be a force for peace in the world. Unless we believe in that vision, and not just blindly believe, but actually put our creative minds to how that's going to happen, then I believe the right really has won, because we're defeated before we ever start. And so I think you have to have that vision. But I think there's two other things that are really important. There's a whole lot of things that are important, but there's two other things that are also really important. Communications does matter. And social media is part of that. I think with the NDP in the last election, Jack Layton's performance in the debate, his performance in Tout le monde en parle, that variety show, and the ads, the brilliant ads that we have, so all of that matters. And it didn't seem to matter in Quebec the last time, but I'm a big believer that on-the-ground organizing matters. I'm a big believer in boosting the vote, that if tenants are less likely to vote, if young people are less likely to vote, if people who are discouraged are less likely to vote, then we got to get off our butts and we got to go out there and we got to knock on doors and talk to people and try to engage them and inspire them to step forward. And even if it's just showing up to a meeting of tenants, if we can get people to come to a tenants meeting in a high rise, I just think if we can get people to take one step past apathy, that we can organize. I just think that's so important. So I think you need all of those things together. And social media can play a big role in that, in terms of trying to motivate people to take that step. But social media alone is not the step. And what was the other? The writing, the redistribution.
Well, and if I could tag on to that, to what extent, getting into some of the fatalism and determinism you were sort of hinting at that often progressives feel, to what extent is geography playing a deterministic role in Canada, whether it's an urban-rural divide or, Alberta versus Ontario? To what extent is that myth, and to what extent with a riding redraw is that going to have a real impact on the shape of Canadian politics?
Yeah, those are really big questions. And one exciting opportunity that I had in the leadership campaign was to go to Alberta and talk to Albertans about the oil patch and what that means to them. We have, in the upcoming election, I guess it's Monday, we have we have amazing NDP candidates. I don't know how they're going to make out. Unfortunately, I'd hoped to get back to knock on doors there, but it didn't work out. But I know we have one candidate that I met who works in the oil patch, and he's a young dad and believes passionately in the NDP, and we've got some amazing candidates there. Having said that, in Alberta, and it's the same in Saskatchewan, people see their economic future tied to the success of the oil and gas industry. Whether or not they have anything to do with that, it raises property prices, it increases unemployment, or increases employment. So people generally see their interests bound up in that. And I don't know if there's a way to reconcile that. I know we have a lot of amazing candidates, a lot of good activists in Alberta. We've got 1 seat there federally. We've got 2 provincially. I think we'll have some more, hopefully, after this election. Albertans are like anybody else. There's a lot of good people there. I think it's economic conditions that are determining their voting patterns. And I think that we have a lot of work to do with rural Canadians. And I don't have a solution for that, but when it was asked of me many times during the leadership campaign, I just said, like any other group, I would want to go and sit and meet with them and listen to their concerns and see how we can work for them. I mean, you see in Saskatchewan where we don't have 1 seat. We got 43% of the vote in, I think it was Saskatoon, over 30% of the provincial vote. We didn't get 1 seat. And that's because there are no pure urban ridings. And once you factor in the rural ridings, we lose. And, because they all have a sliver, urban, rural. And I don't know if it's impossible to represent rural people in Saskatchewan. We represent lots of rural people in Quebec and Ontario, although it amazes me in places like Chatham or where was I? Burlington. Was it Burlington? No. Anyway, I was in a community in Ontario recently where they said they'd had over the last 2 years 43 plant closures, and they elect a Conservative. In Chatham, where they've had massive deindustrialization, they elect a Conservative. Oshawa, they elect a Conservative. Niagara, they elect a Conservative. So I think that we have a lot of work to do in terms of just connecting with people, listening to them, and our candidates there will have a lot of good ideas. But I think because they're ridings where we haven't done well, we haven't put the resources into those areas.
Mm-hmm. Seb, you have a question?
Yeah. I guess it was sort of unavoidable to have a question about the uniting the left type of thing. I think clearly, there's a former New Democrat that's the interim leader of the Liberals. There's a former Liberal who is the leader of the New Democrats. So it's natural for that.
Job's already done.
So without asking you to take sort of an absolutist position either way, you obviously did have the opportunity to speak with people across the country, and I'm sure people made good arguments for both a merger and not a merger. I'm just wondering, what were those arguments? What do people think is good about a merger, and what do people are people hesitant about?
Well, that's an interesting way you asked the question, because it was something that was always present on people's minds. And Nathan Cullen campaigned overtly not on a merger, but on a specific form of cooperation that really caught people's imagination, especially in British Columbia. In terms of merger, I think the arguments for it are obviously uniting opposition to the Conservatives, and that's appealing because people very, very badly want to get rid of the Conservatives, and they want to replace them with the NDP. And people see a merger as a good way to do that. I mean, I'm sure Liberals want to replace them with the Liberals. So people raise that. I think the arguments against, 2 arguments I heard frequently against a merger. One was Liberals have rejected it outright, and secondly, that a lot of people felt that the NDP has fought so hard for its social democratic values that if the price of power is that we lose those values and become a Liberal Party, then what was the point? So I think that was the other side of the argument. Nathan was arguing for the ability of riding associations where you have an incumbent Conservative, cooperation between opposition riding associations, so that if they decide to only run one candidate, they could choose to do that, so that there would only be one candidate against against the Conservative. Arguments against that. Some people argued you're assuming that all Liberals will vote. Say it's an NDP candidate, suppose. You're assuming all Liberals will support that candidate. That in fact, some of them may go to the Conservatives if there is no Liberal candidate. Also, one other argument was that it would be extremely divisive and difficult for riding associations to cooperate when they have campaigned against each other in elections. I mean, it sounds good in theory. I try to think of my own riding. Could we do that? It was a little more challenging when you bring it down to a specific example. And so there was that. And one other argument was, could a riding association make the decision that they were not going to field a candidate and deny people who may always vote, say, Liberal, that they're not going to have the chance to vote for a Liberal because the few people on the riding association made the decision there would be no Liberal candidate. So those were some arguments, but I think the notion generally of cooperation is extremely appealing to people.
Time for one last question before I throw my own last question.
I've been a part of 2 election campaigns now, and it's really apparent to me how valuable a local base of identified support is. I mean, you need people to put up the signs, you need people to run the phones, you need people to knock on doors. But what's not readily apparent to me is how that gets built. So if you were one of, say, the McGill 5 or someone in a rural Quebec riding, you're 20 years old, you've never held any sort of elected office in your life, what are you doing to build that support? Like, do you go and start door knocking immediately, taking down numbers, or what?
Excellent question. Yeah, I'll tell you one member of Parliament. What she's done is started mapping her constituency, and it's the kind of thing that generally you build up over time. Like, for example, in our riding, I have records of who I've talked to and, over the years, but she didn't knock on every door in the last election. And so she's got a team, and she is in the process of knocking on every door. She wants to knock on every door, and everybody 14 or over, she figures will be eligible to vote by the next election. So she's been trying to identify, how did they vote in the last election? Where are they at today? What are their issues, languages? Are they interested in becoming involved? Would they come to a meeting? Would they like a sign in the next election? So that's what they're doing, and that they will find volunteers, and they will build that riding association. What others have been doing is some of them had to actually build a riding association. Some of them didn't have an executive, so they had to put that in place. And they're doing things like meetings. So, for example, Laurier-Sainte-Marie in downtown Montreal, which was the riding of Gilles Duceppe, they had a terrific executive, and I'm unaware whether they've been there for years or they're new, I don't know. But they elected a terrific MP, Hélène Laverdière. She's a former federal government diplomat. She's now responsible for the Americas as her critic portfolio. And what they did was host a debate, the first Montreal debate, and it was outside of the official debates. So they did this amazingly professional debate. They made sure they got all of the candidates, and they set it up very professionally. They got all the media there. They had to twice move to a bigger room, and they had hundreds of people show up, and it was an amazingly successful event. I'm sure they got lots of volunteers as a result. So rather than knocking on every door, or maybe they're also doing that, but they had one big, very successful event. I think both are good ways, and things certainly that we try to do in our riding.
So last question for today, and this is one I was actually surprised no one got up to ask, and that's the robocall scandal, which I'm curious to hear from both perspectives. One, it's been really refreshing today to hear you have the ability to separate yourself and talk about politics without having, the politician's identity bias your views. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where the robocall scandal is going to go, not as Peggy Nash MP, but as Peggy Nash political animal who's been watching politics for a long time. But I am, of course, also interested in what the NDP is going to do around the robocall scandal. And if you can at all speak to perhaps strategically how the party might use that, both in terms of questioning the Conservative Party's electoral practices, but also starting to build the sort of government in waiting and really the campaign that will lead into the next federal election.
I mean, let me say first of all that all political parties phoned. Like during the leadership campaigns, any of you who are members might have got the odd phone call. So, you know, everybody phones. But the allegation here is that there was deliberate misinformation, sending people to the wrong polling stations so that they would not show up and vote for, I think in the most, what seems to be the worst case was for the Liberals, but I don't know all of the ridings that are affected. If it is true that individuals were impersonating Elections Canada officials with a view to denying people their right to vote, then there will likely be criminal charges. Mm-hmm. So as I understand it, where it's at right now is with Elections Canada, who's doing an initial investigation. I don't think we've heard back from them yet. And if it looks like there is grounds for further investigation, then my guess is somebody will be trying to involve the police in an investigation. I look at a riding like Etobicoke Centre where the Conservatives won by, I think, 26 votes, something like that. It was a very tiny margin. So in Guelph, I think the margin was quite large, so it's unclear whether it would have affected the outcome in Etobicoke Centre. If it's, you know, if it looks like that happened, it could have affected the outcome, and there are probably other ridings that the margin was small. I think it's this notion of having legitimacy and integrity. You know, the Conservatives rode to Ottawa on a campaign to bring accountability in politics. You know, it was the backdrop of the sponsorship scandal where tax dollars were used to basically dissuade people from exercising their democratic vote. And so there was this notion they were going to clean up Ottawa and provide integrity. They were going to clean up not only the financial aspects, but they were going to clean up public appointments and get rid of all these patronage appointments, whether it's in the Senate or in other public positions, and they were going to provide financial accountability. So instead, what have we seen? I mean, they've packed the Senate with all of their fundraisers and failed candidates, and basically securing you know, the success of any Conservative bill that goes through. And I have personal experience around public appointments with the accountability legislation. They were going to create this accountability committee, and they wanted, they were going to have this committee that was going to vet all of the public appointments. Gwyn Morgan, who was the former CEO of Encana, they wanted him to take this position for $1 a year. And I and some others disagreed with some public statements he had made around ethnicity and crime. And so we recommended against his appointment. The government was furious about it, and so they never appointed anybody to that position. And now this committee has been getting this funding for doing nothing all this time. So now when the government is in a majority position, it could put whoever they want in this committee to provide accountability. They've canceled the committee after spending all this money on it. So their campaign for accountability, their campaign for transparency, for fiscal responsibility. I mean, witness, chopper rides from hunting camps to the F-35 scandal. All of the issues around transparency and accountability, fiscal responsibility, respect for the dollars that are sent to Ottawa are, there's a case to be made increasingly that they have failed. And that's something we'll continue to build on. And it's a question of, can you trust them, and do they have integrity? And I don't think we can, and I don't think they do. And so we'll see how things develop. I mean, I don't want to prejudge the outcome of the robocall issue, but there's a smell test right now that I think most people are responding to.
And I mean, certainly the in-and-out scandal and some of the other messiness that the parties got into has not necessarily cost them either the media hits or the popularity dips that one would expect. So I think the challenge moving forward is to translate some of that activity into actual changes in Canadian political opinion. But I think it's been very generous of you to come on a Sunday and spend this time with us, which has been very interesting and certainly builds into the body of knowledge we're building. That does make, I think, politics very accessible and exciting, and something that I think young people and old people of all ages would love to get involved in. So if we could give a round of applause to Peggy Nash.